2 weeks had passed since Alina fled the Langston estate. 2 weeks since she saw Robert's pale face vanish into the night. She should have felt safe now, free, alive. But she didn't. She was living in a modest apartment the police had arranged for her, tucked away under a different name. They said it was for her protection. They didn't say it out loud, but she knew what they thought. She married a rich old man and snapped when he got controlling. The case had gone nowhere. Robert Langston had disappeared without a trace. No fingerprints, no signs of struggle, no financial activity. It was as if the billionaire had vanished into thin air. But Alina knew better. He was out there, watching, waiting. And some nights, she could feel him. The first incident was small. Her bathroom mirror fogged up with the words "You're mine" written on it. The building manager swore no one else had been inside. Then came the dream. Or was it a dream? She had woken in the middle of the night to the scent of Robert's cologne, that heavy, expensive, choking scent, and the feeling of cold breath on her neck. But her door was locked. The police dismissed it as trauma, PTSD, hallucinations from stress. But she knew. Robert wasn't just a man anymore. He had become something else, something not entirely human, and worse, he wasn't done with her. The old radiator in Alina's apartment hissed loudly, its pipes groaning in the silence of the early morning. She hadn't slept. Not really. She'd spent the night sitting up on the couch, blanket pulled around her shoulders, Evelyn's journal in her lap. It had become her obsession, her lifeline. She had read it dozens of times already, but still, she found herself flipping through its worn pages, searching for something she might have missed, some warning, some clue, some escape. On the inside of the back cover, there was a name scribbled faintly in fading ink. Margot Delaney, Rosewell Clinic, 1997. Alina's fingers hovered over the name. She hadn't noticed it before. Maybe she'd skipped it in her panic. Maybe she hadn't wanted to know more, but now she had no choice. She needed answers. That morning, Alina called the clinic. It was an old psychiatric facility outside the city, now half defunct. After lying her way through a few questions, she found what she was looking for. Margot Delaney had been a psychiatrist specializing in high-profile domestic abuse cases. She had worked with Evelyn Langston just months before Evelyn died. Alina's heart pounded as she stood outside the cracked, ivy-covered gates of the Rosewell Clinic. It felt abandoned, forgotten. A woman in her 60s answered the door after a long knock. Her eyes were sharp, observant. She didn't smile. "You're here about Evelyn," she said, before Alina could even speak. Alina nodded slowly. Margot stepped aside. "Then you'd better come in." The inside of the clinic was cold and dimly lit. Dusty, like time had stopped moving. Margot led her to a small office filled with files, paper stacks, and old case boxes. "I knew he'd do it again," she said as she sat down. "I saw it in his eyes back then, the obsession, the control." Alina clenched her jaw. "You mean Robert?" Margot gave her a sharp look. "That man doesn't just love women. He possesses them. He breaks them until they don't remember who they were. Evelyn came to me in pieces, but she was trying to put herself back together. She wanted to leave." Alina pulled out the journal from her bag and handed it over. Margot scanned it quickly, then nodded. She wrote this when she was planning her escape. That's why the pages are ripped. He found it, he must have. Alina swallowed hard. "I look just like her." "Yes," Margot said, "and that's no accident." "What do you mean?" Margot stood, walked to a dusty cabinet, and pulled out a thin black folder. Inside was a photograph. Another woman, young, pretty, soft eyes, the same features as Evelyn and as Alina. "This is Juliet Kane. She went missing in 1985. She was engaged to Robert Langston before Evelyn." Alina stared at the photo in horror. "That's not all," Margot said quietly, laying down 3 more photos. Different women, different years, different names, but all of them looked just like her. He had been searching, replacing, over and over again, and now it was Alina's turn. Alina left the Rosewell Clinic with the weight of centuries pressing on her shoulders. 4 women, all gone, all resembling Evelyn, all resembling her. She sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, Evelyn's journal open on the passenger seat. Robert Langston wasn't just a man obsessed with a dead wife. He was something far more sinister, and possibly something inhuman. Later that night, Alina returned to her apartment, nerves frayed and body exhausted. She locked every bolt, slid the heavy dresser in front of the door and closed every curtain. She made tea, though her hands were still trembling. She kept Evelyn's journal open beside her, going through each page again like a ritual, like prayer. But something strange happened. As she flipped to a page she knew by heart, she noticed new ink, a line she had never seen before. He lives in the mirror now. Alina froze. The handwriting matched Evelyn's. The page wasn't wet. It wasn't a dream. It had just appeared. She whipped around to face the mirror above the fireplace. Her reflection stared back, wide-eyed, pale, trembling. But behind her, a shadow moved. She turned around instantly. No one was there. Her throat tightened. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. She backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the mirror. The shadow was gone. But the words weren't. They were now on the glass. "I found you, Evelyn," she screamed. She didn't remember grabbing her keys or running barefoot down the hallway. She just ran, out the door, down the stairs, into the street. She didn't stop until she reached the police station. But they didn't believe her. They never did. The officer on duty glanced at the clock. "Ma'am, we have no legal evidence Robert Langston has harmed you. We've had no sighting. There's no crime scene, no fingerprints, nothing." "He was in my apartment," she snapped. "He wrote on my mirror. Look at this." She held up the journal. The officer sighed. "It's an old journal. You could have written that." Alina's breath caught. "He's not human." He paused. "Excuse me?" He's not aging. He disappears. No one finds him. He knows things. He moves like he's not real. He's in my mirror, in my mind, and I think—" The officer gently stood. "Ma'am, we're going to call someone to talk to you, maybe a counselor." Alina backed away. "No, you don't get it." She realized then she was on her own. That night she returned to her apartment. She didn't want to. Every part of her screamed to run, to hide, to disappear. But something else pushed her forward. Anger, defiance. She would not end up like Evelyn, or Juliet, or the others. If Robert Langston was a monster, then she would become the girl who hunted the monster. Alina set candles around the room. She burned sage. She scribbled the names of the missing women on paper and taped them around the mirror. Then she sat, waiting, watching. And just before midnight, the candlelight flickered violently. Her reflection changed. It wasn't just her in the mirror. It was him, standing behind her, pale, still, with eyes like empty winter sky. "Alina," he whispered through the glass. "You're finally becoming hers." Her lips trembled. "Whose?" He smiled. "Mine." The mirror was cold, fogged from the inside, but Alina wasn't breathing on it. She stepped back, staring into Robert's reflection. He was smiling, calm and far too close. But when she turned around, the space behind her was empty. Only in the mirror. He lived there now. Alina's mind spun, but she refused to look away. "You're not real," she whispered. His reflection tilted its head, amused. "Aren't I?" Then the glass rippled. Ripples. In glass. Her stomach turned. She stumbled backward, heart pounding as the candle flames all around her flickered violently, as if gasping. A voice, not his, but feminine, broken, trembling, whispered behind her. "Don't let him win." She turned sharply. No one. But when she looked back into the mirror, Evelyn was there. Her face was gaunt, pale. Her eyes were sad, hollow. She stood just behind Robert's shoulder, her hand pressed against the inside of the glass like she was trying to break through. Alina froze. "Evelyn?" The figure nodded once. Then the mirror cracked, just slightly, right over Robert's heart. Alina stumbled forward, her breath fogging the glass. "What do I do?" Evelyn's lips moved slowly. "Go back." Alina blinked. "Go back where?" But the mirror snapped back to normal. No cracks, No Evelyn, no Robert, just her reflection, alone. But the message was clear. The answers weren't in hiding. They were back at the estate, where it all began. The next morning, Alina packed a small bag. She didn't tell the police. She didn't tell anyone. They wouldn't believe her. She drove out of the city, her heart thudding against her ribs with every mile. The trees grew thicker, darker, the sky turned grey, and the road curved like a snake guiding her back into the mouth of the beast. When the Langston estate finally came into view, it looked like it had aged 100 years. The gardens were wild. The iron gates hung crooked. The house itself sat under a blanket of mist, its windows like hollow eyes, abandoned or pretending to be. She forced herself to push open the rusted gate and step inside. The front door creaked open as if it had been waiting for her. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs clung to chandeliers. But the strange thing was, the air didn't feel dead. It felt watchful, like the house had a heartbeat. Alina made her way to Evelyn's old room, the one with the photos, the vanity, and the hidden memories. She dropped to her knees and pulled out the journal again. There had to be more, something else. And there was. Hidden in the spine of the book, she found a torn page, one that had been stuffed deep inside the binding. It read, "He doesn't age, he doesn't sleep, he doesn't bleed. He made a vow to keep her alive, even if it meant dying over and over again himself. But she didn't want him anymore. So now he brings us back, over and over, until one of us stays." Alina's hands shook. Robert had made a pact. He wasn't just obsessive. He had bound his soul to the idea of Evelyn, and she, Alina, was just the next reincarnation, the one he hoped would finally choose to stay. A soft knock echoed through the house. Alina stood slowly. Another knock. At the mirror behind her, she turned. There he was again, smiling, calm. "Are you ready to come home now, Evelyn?" he asked softly. Her throat went dry. "I'm not her." Robert tilted his head. "No, not yet." Then he lifted one hand and pointed toward the floor. Alina looked down, and beneath the cracked floorboards, glowing faintly beneath the dust, were names. Juliet, Evelyn, Rachel, Isabel, Alina. The last name wasn't finished. It was still being carved. Alina stepped back from the mirror, her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the names carved into the wood beneath. Her feet. Juliet, Evelyn, Rachel, Isabel. And now, Alina. Her name was only half-etched. The letters were fresh, the grooves red, not with ink but with something darker, thicker, sticky, blood. Her legs almost gave out. She had read horror stories, watched films, but nothing could compare to the cold, bone-deep realization that her soul was being claimed piece by piece, that this house was a trap, and Robert wasn't just trying to keep her. He was trying to finish her. The air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped. The candle she had lit earlier snuffed out on its own. Alina turned toward the mirror. Robert was still there. But something had changed. His face was softer now, less monstrous. He looked sad. "I didn't want it to be like this," he whispered. "Not again." Alina's voice cracked. "What are you?" He hesitated. "A man who made a mistake, a long time ago. A vow to love someone forever, even after death." She shook her head. "You killed them. Every woman you brought here." "No," he said. "They chose not to stay, that's all. The curse doesn't like rejection, it punishes them. I never meant for that to happen." Alina's hands balled into fists. "Then end it. End this." "I can't." His expression flickered with pain. "The vow lives in the wood, in the mirror, in the lake. It was never meant to break." She stared at him. "Then I'll do it for you." He tilted his head. "You'd destroy me?" She swallowed. "You're already dead." For the first time, Robert looked truly afraid. Alina began searching the room, behind the dresser, under the bed, inside the closet. She ripped through Evelyn's vanity drawers until she found it. A small locked box, wooden, black. She didn't know how she knew, but this was it. the core, the heart of the curse. She pried it open with the edge of a cracked mirror shard. Inside were trinkets, tiny haunting pieces from every woman Robert had tried to keep. A gold earring, a torn piece of lace, a dried rose petal, a necklace, her necklace, the one her mother had given her as a child before she ever met Robert. "How?" she whispered. "You've been here before," Robert's voice said from behind the glass. Alina spun. "What did you say?" He stared at her with hollow sadness. "This isn't your first time." And suddenly, memories rushed into her mind. Flashes of water, drowning, of a scream in the hallway, of her hand pressed against a mirror. She gasped. She was Evelyn, not just a look-alike. She had lived it, died here, forgotten everything, and been born again. And now, she was back. The house began to tremble. The box in her hand grew hot. The objects inside pulsed like tiny hearts. "You know what you have to do," Evelyn's voice echoed in her mind. "Burn it. Destroy the heart of the vow." Alina stumbled to the fireplace, tossed the box in. She hesitated only for a second, then grabbed the candle and threw it in after. The fire roared to life. The trinkets inside screamed, not like objects, not like metal or glass. They screamed like souls being ripped free. The mirror behind her cracked, one deep, jagged line. Robert's face twisted in agony. "No!" he cried. "You don't understand. If you destroy the vow, you destroy me." Alina stood tall, tears falling silently. "Then let it end." The flames roared, the mirror shattered. The room exploded with wind and heat and light, then silence. When Alina opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor. The house was quiet. Dust floated gently in the air. The mirror was gone. The fireplace empty, and the names beneath the floorboards burned away, all of them, even hers. She stood slowly. There was no sign of Robert. No whispers, no shadows. The curse was broken. 3 days had passed. Alina hadn't told anyone what happened. Not the police, not the reporters who still whispered about the missing billionaire bride. She didn't care. All she knew was that the house was gone, burned from the inside out. The curse had been broken, but not everything had ended. Because something was still inside her. It started with the dreams, not nightmares exactly, more like echoes. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her hands reaching out to someone who wasn't there. She would speak names she didn't recognize. Rachel, Juliet, Isabel. And then one night, she woke up speaking Latin, fluently, a language she had never studied in her life. By the 4th night, the air in her apartment began to change. It felt heavier, watchful, like the walls were waiting for something. She sat in bed, staring at the crack in her ceiling, feeling something pulse through the building like a heartbeat. She glanced toward her closet. The door was ajar. She hadn't left it like that. Alina slipped out of bed slowly, bare feet pressing, into the cold wood floor. She crossed the room and reached for the closet door. Inside, nothing, just clothes. But when she turned back around, her mirror was fogged. She hadn't even taken a shower. She walked toward it cautiously. The fog slid away in a thin, perfect circle, revealing a reflection that wasn't quite right. She leaned in. Her face wasn't hers. It shifted. For just a second, a flicker. Her eyes turned grey, her lips fuller, her hair darker. Evelyn. Then it snapped back. Alina stumbled away from the mirror, heart hammering. No. No. She had burned the box, broken the curse, hadn't she? She returned to Margot Delaney the next day, desperate and pale. Margot opened the door with weary eyes. "I've been expecting you." Alina blinked. "You knew I'd come back." The older woman sighed. "You broke the chain, yes, but you didn't destroy the bond." "What bond?" Margot walked back to her office, pulling a thick folder from her shelf. She opened it on the desk and pointed to an old photo, a mirror in the Langston estate. "It's called an echo room," Margot explained. "A place where the dead can replay their final emotions, grief, anger, obsession, Robert created one, with his grief. But it wasn't just his. Evelyn's sorrow was powerful too. Alina stared at the photo. "So what happens now?" "You're the last vessel," Margot said softly. "You carry pieces of them all, their voices, their faces. You're not haunted. You're inhabited." Alina's voice trembled. "Is there a way to undo it?" Margot hesitated. "Maybe. But it won't be easy. You'll have to go back." Alina stiffened. "Back where?" Margot looked at her, with a weight of truth behind her eyes. "Into the echo." That night Alina lit a candle, stood before her mirror and whispered, "Show me what's left." The flame bent backward, the room went silent, and slowly the mirror began to melt like water, revealing a corridor of darkness on the other side. A hallway that shouldn't exist, but did. Alina stared into the portal and stepped through. The moment Alina stepped through the mirror, she felt the world stretch and shift, like time had forgotten how to move properly. She was no longer in her apartment, no longer anywhere human. This place, it was dim and silent, lit only by a cold, silvery glow from nowhere and everywhere at once. The walls were made of glass etched with moving images, memories like film reels caught in an eternal loop. She passed by one pane. Inside it, Evelyn stood at the vanity, brushing her hair, tears in her eyes. Behind her, Robert watched with quiet obsession. The next, Juliet, struggling as she screamed at a locked window. Her voice was silent in the loop, but the pain in her eyes said enough. Each memory belonged to a different woman. Each of them had been trapped here, and all of them were versions of her. Alina kept walking. Her reflection flickered in the glass as she passed. Sometimes it looked like her, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes she had Evelyn's face, sometimes Juliet's. Once, she saw Robert's face staring back, whispering, "You'll stay. They always do." She kept going, until the corridor split, and at the center of the fork stood a tall black door. It was unlike anything else in the echo. It pulsed like it was alive. Hand carved into it, not just scratched but bleeding into the wood, was her full name, Alina Grace Hollow. She hadn't told anyone her middle name, not even Robert. This place, it knew her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. The second her fingers touched it, a wave of memories crashed into her. Not hers, Evelyn's, Juliet's, Rachel's, Isabel's, all of them. Love, fear, screaming, drowning, burning, a lake at night, hands around a throat. A vow whispered. Into a mirror. Her knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't do this." But then a hand touched her shoulder. Warm, gentle, familiar. She turned, and Evelyn was there, fully formed, beautiful, pale, and sad. "You have to end it," Evelyn whispered. "We're trapped because of him. But you're the only one who ever made it out." Alina looked up at the door again. "What's behind it?" Evelyn's eyes darkened. Him, the last piece, the vow itself. "If I open it, will I survive?" "I don't know," Evelyn said. "But if you don't, we'll never leave. We'll just keep coming back." Alina stood. Her legs still shook, but her spine was steady. She reached for the door. It opened, and inside was a perfect replica of Robert's study. The fireplace lit, the curtains drawn. The scent of sandalwood and aged scotch filled the air. And in the center, Robert. But not quite. This Robert looked young, early 30s. His skin flawless, his suit sharp, his eyes no longer empty, but filled with something ancient and cruel. He looked up and smiled. "I've been waiting for you." Alina stepped into the room, heart pounding like thunder in her ears. Robert, or whatever was wearing Robert's face, rose from the chair by the fire, smoothing the sleeves of his crisp black suit. "You've come a long way," he said, "but you always do." His voice was smooth, hypnotic. It reached inside, her like a cold hand closing around her spine. "This place," Alina said, her voice cracking. "This is where you keep them?" He gave a soft, pitying smile. "They kept themselves. I offered them love, shelter, a place to be eternal. They rejected it. They were terrified of you." He stepped closer. The light of the fire twisted on his skin, and for just a moment, his reflection in the glass behind him wasn't human. Twisted limbs, hollowed eyes, a mouth too wide to belong to anything living. A glimpse of the truth. "Love becomes terrifying when it's eternal," he said. "When you realize you can't run from it. You can't hide from something that lives inside your name." He pointed to her chest. "To your soul." Alina took a step back, fists clenched. "You tricked them. You cursed them. You made them love you so you could own them." "No," he said, almost sadly. "They all loved me. But when love fades, it leaves a vacuum, a hunger. And I had to feed it, to stay alive." Her voice trembled. "You bound your soul to a mirror. You turned grief into a prison. And still," he whispered, "you came back." He reached out his hand. "Come to me, Evelyn." That name again. It made her skin crawl. "I'm not Evelyn," she said, tears slipping down her cheek. "I'm Alina. And I remember now. I remember drowning, burning, falling, all of it." His smile faded. Something ancient stirred behind his eyes. "Then you remember the vow," he said, "until death unites us again." Alina's body felt like it was being pulled apart from the inside. Her memories, hers and theirs, blended together. Pain, terror, love, fire, water. But in the middle of it all lent a voice, Evelyn's voice. "You can break it. Finish what I couldn't." Alina screamed. Her hands flew to her chest. Something was burning beneath her skin, the mark he'd carved into all of them. She dropped to her knees, choking on the heat rising from her bones. Robert watched, unmoving, a shadow falling across his face. "You can't fight what's written in blood," he whispered. But she could feel them. Juliet, Isabel, Rachel, Evelyn. They were rising, through her, with her. Alina looked up, her eyes no longer just hers. They glowed with the fury of generations of stolen women. And in that moment, she wasn't afraid anymore. She stood, walked to the mirror hanging behind the fireplace and whispered, "Let the vow return to the one who made it." The mirror shattered inward, glass flying like daggers. Robert screamed, not in rage, in fear. His form twisted, shook. The young facade peeled away, revealing the horror underneath. A skeletal, rotting, ancient creature, bound together by memories and grief. "No!" he roared. "You belong to me!" But Alina stepped forward, every soul he had ever stolen behind her. She spoke just 3 words. "Not anymore, Robert." She placed her hand on his chest, and he exploded into ash. When she opened her eyes again, the room was gone. The mirror was gone. The echo was gone. And for the first time in centuries, so was Robert Langston. Alina stood alone in a blank white space where the echo room had once been. No more shadows, no mirrors, no whispers, just silence. The air was still, unnaturally so. She looked down at her hands, burned, bruised, trembling but free. She whispered Evelyn's name. No response. Not in her mind, not in her body. They were gone. All of them. Their souls had passed. She was herself again. She should have felt peace. But something inside her didn't. Something lingered. The real world returned like a wave of sound after deep silence. Alina gasped as she collapsed on her apartment floor. The mirror behind her cracked into pieces, her candle extinguished, smoke trailing up like a final breath. It was done. It was over. Or so she thought. Weeks passed. Alina tried to rebuild. Therapy, moving boxes, calls with lawyers to officially declare Robert Langston deceased. She avoided mirrors, covered every single one in her apartment. Until one afternoon, Unpacking an old box, she found something strange. A velvet pouch. She didn't remember owning it. Inside was a key. Silver, heavy, cold. Attached to it was a card. Just one word written in black ink. Inheritance. Her stomach dropped. That night, a knock came at her door. Not a loud knock, just soft. Rhythmic. She peeked through the peephole. No one. But on the floor was a letter sealed with red wax. The seal. An ornate L. Langston. She opened it with shaking hands. To Alina Grace Hollow, sole legal heir to the Langston estate. Per Mr. Langston's final arrangements, you are entitled to the vault beneath the house. Your key will grant you access. Her breath caught. She thought she'd burned the estate to the ground. Apparently, not all of it. Alina. Drove out at dawn, back to the woods, back to the ruins of the Langston estate. It was a graveyard now, charred skeletons of walls, blackened marble, vines reclaiming what wealth had stolen from nature. But at the far edge of the lot, just beyond the lake, she found it, a heavy stone door in the earth, untouched by fire. She inserted the key. It turned with a low, grinding sound. The door creaked open, revealing stairs descending into darkness. A cold breath of air greeted her, and as she stepped into the vault, the walls lit up, lined with portraits. Of her. Not just her, Evelyn, Rachel, Juliet, Isabel, and more, dozens, all identical, all watching. And in the center of the room, a glass case. Inside, ashes, floating unnaturally. Still pulsing, still breathing. Robert wasn't fully gone. He had anchored himself to something else, to her blood, her name, and as her fingers touched the edge of the glass, the ashes twisted into words. I made you. You were always mine. Alina stumbled away from the glass case, heart slamming so hard in her chest she could barely breathe. The ashes inside moved like they were alive, swirling in mid-air without any wind, as though gravity had lost interest. The words still hung, suspended in the smoke. I made you. You were always mine. No, she whispered. You're dead. I ended you. But her voice sounded small in the stone chamber, like a child arguing with thunder. She backed toward the stairs, but the door slammed shut above her, without anyone touching it. She was trapped. The air grew colder. From the walls, the portraits of every woman began to whisper, but not random voices, her own voice, over and over again, from different lives, different deaths. One screamed, one begged, one sang a lullaby she'd never heard before, but somehow knew the words. Alina covered her ears, her breath coming in short gasps. Stop! 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 The whispers cut out, but the ashes ignited. A soft glow filled the case, and from it, a drop of blood. Rose, her blood. She hadn't cut herself, hadn't bled. But somehow the vault had taken it. Robert's voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere. My curse wasn't broken, you just inherited it. Alina screamed, punching the glass, but it didn't even crack. Her knuckles split open and more. Blood hit the case. The ash shivered in delight. Then something strange happened. The portraits on the walls began to cry. Tears streamed down their painted faces, red, not clear. They were bleeding. The stone beneath Alina's feet turned wet. Sticky, she looked down. A sigil had appeared in blood, ancient, circular, pulsing. At its center, her name. She dropped to her knees, trying to rub it out, but the blood just spread. It wrapped around her fingers, soaking into her skin, into her bones. Her veins burned like they were being rewritten. And then she heard her mother's voice, not from her memory, from the chamber. You were always meant for something more, baby. You just didn't know what. Alina choked back a sob. No, 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 no. The sigil blazed with red light. The case exploded, glass flying in every direction, but it didn't cut her. The ashes floated toward her, and stopped, then swirled, then entered her mouth. She screamed, falling backward, her body convulsing, the darkness inside her expanding. And with it memories not just of lives, but of power. She saw Robert at his youngest, standing at an altar made of mirrors, making a vow to never die, to reincarnate, to live through the blood of his chosen, not just wives, not just lovers, vessels. He had been grooming her soul for generations. Alina woke hours later, or maybe days. She was lying at the foot of the stairs. The glass was gone, the sigil faded, but the portraits were still crying, and inside her chest, a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Something had changed, something had awakened, and when she stood, the shadows bowed,